Ring this afternoon at 2 with Sean Hannity, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. The wonders of government, right? Those who possess the secret knowledge, those central planners who know what's best for you, and you will comply. How about when it comes to your access of healthcare services? The National Healthcare Service in the UK, NICE, I love that acronym, that Orwellian acronym, will ban patients from surgery indefinitely unless they lose weight or quit smoking. New restrictions promoted that would eliminate access to non-urgent surgery for obese patients as well as for smokers. Obese patients would have to reduce their weight, except in extraordinary circumstances. And smokers would be referred for operations only after they've stopped smoking for at least 8 weeks. That's government rationing. So,
Wow.
what do you think? You like
What are
that?
the special cases where if you could keep your obesity?
I'm sure case-by-case basis. I'm sure it would be like an existential threat to
Yeah.
your life. You know, you're having a heart attack or a stroke or something like this. But the point is, this false choice that's presented by the commissars like Comrade Bernie and other proponents of single-payer, like the entire Democrat Party, who a world without rationing, that's when government is in charge, right? Wrong. So foreshadowing of what's to come in this country if Republicans can't get their act together and start to walk back from the backdoor takeover of health care through the health insurance market via Obamacare. For more on how we can walk that back, we're pleased to be joined by Philip Klein, the managing editor for the Washington Examiner and the author of Overcoming Obamacare, 3 Approaches to Reversing the Government Takeover of Healthcare. Philip, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So the 3 approaches for reversing the government takeover of health care, we can't seem to get any approach through the Republican-led Senate, but what do you think holds the most promise and is the most politically sellable of what you propose as the way back?
Well, I mean, the problem is that, I mean, my book was actually written about 2 years ago, anticipating that Republicans could find themselves in control of government and in a position to deliver on their promises to repeal and replace. And when I wrote the book, I said, look, there are different visions for how to go about trying to repeal and replace Obamacare. And unless Republicans work out those differences now, then it's going to be a problem when they take power. And that's, unfortunately, I wish I were wrong in this case, but unfortunately that's exactly what happened. When they were out of power, they tried to do a lot of, score a lot of short-term messaging victories, and they didn't do the hard work of trying to overcome some of their differences on the specifics of healthcare. So it was always easier to just default to attacking Obamacare.
Well, right.
As a result, when they finally got in power, it was a complete mess because they had no plan and they had to essentially start from scratch. And you had to try in the Senate to try to come up with some compromise when you have a caucus that ideologically stretches from Susan Collins, who's basically a Democrat, to Rand Paul.
Well, I know where we are, but President Trump, in his interview with Maria Bartiromo over the weekend, suggested again that he still thinks that replace of Obamacare, replace kind of in quotation marks, something on the order of Graham Cassidy will get out of the Senate and get to his desk. Maybe he's being overly optimistic, but that's what he's saying. And so is something like Graham Cassidy on the substance of it, the block granting of Medicaid funds and the like, is that the beginnings of the way back from this backdoor takeover?
I mean, I think it's difficult because the problem is that in Graham Cassidy, the whole question, the way I sort of judge these plans that talk about giving states flexibility is sort of under a given plan. Can you if a state wanted to pursue a real free market approach, would they have the option to? And I think, unfortunately, under Graham Cassidy, and certainly under any version of Graham Cassidy that might be able to make it through the Senate, the answer is probably no, just because it keeps so many of Obamacare's regulations on the board at the national level that it's hard for states to have enough wiggle room and latitude to really move into a free market direction. So the question you're asking, turns out to be, is it marginally better than Obamacare? Maybe, and that's something where the argument is, but let's not kid ourselves into thinking that this would be real repeal and replace. It would be more of a reform of Obamacare. So when you sort of say, well, what's a good plan that could get through Congress, it sort of suggests that it's sort of like saying, I feel like you're asking me, like, I'm a doctor, and why don't you operate on this dead patient, because it's sort of like there are plenty of ideas that I could conceive of that would be good, but it seems like John McCain and Susan Collins and Murkowski and others are just in the mood to vote down anything and constantly move the goalposts.
And the cost-sharing subsidies that Trump rescinded, and he's not necessarily signed on to Lamar Alexander's resuscitation of them. That doesn't change the political dynamic at all to get some of them to move?
I don't really think so. The Democrats certainly are willing to perfectly happy if things blow up and they can just blame Trump for Obamacare's failures and for any collapse in the insurance markets that's sort of reinforced or accelerated by not funding the payments. And so I think that you're not going to really get Democratic buy-in, and they can't pass it at this point without Democrats because they can't use reconciliation anymore.
What would it do?
Which is the procedure that, would have enabled them to pass something with a simple majority.
Was there any aspect of the Graham Cassidy bill that you liked?
I mean, I think that the theory, the concept behind trying to say, okay, let's turn this over to the states and give them money and give them the ability to design the healthcare systems that fit their particular, the ideological and cultural sensibilities of a given state, I think that's good conceptually. My questions were really about whether or not in practice it could give those states the type of flexibility that they need.
Yeah, and Republicans are in a real trick bag because unless they have other accomplishments to point to, the idea of going into the 2018 cycle, even with these Democrats in red states, saying, well, I know we told you we needed control of the Senate, but what we really need is 60. So if you give us those +8 that we need to knock out the likes of Joe Donnelly and Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin and so on, then we get to 60, then we have more of a margin for error with respect to the Susan Collinses and the Lisa Murkowskis of the world. That's a pretty difficult election year argument to make, I think.
Yeah, especially when you have sort of Steve Bannon and people like him trying to agitate and make the argument against leadership. This is sort of a classic example. Republicans have been arguing for 7 years that they're going to repeal and replace Obamacare, and then given the chance, they can't get the job done. And the problem with Republicans is, though, defenders of leadership will say, look, we have a fractured caucus and it's only a majority of 52, right? But the problem is when they're running for office, they don't have all these caveats, right?
Yes.
They run for office in 2010 and say, elect us and we'll repeal Obamacare. Then after they get elected and they take over the House, they say, oh, well, really, we need the Senate too. And then they take over the Senate and they say, well, as long as Obama's here, we can't do it. We need a Republican. So then you give them a Republican and say, oh, we need 60 votes. I mean, at some point, this sort of strategy of promising the moon when you're running for office and then all of a sudden saying, well, we have to think practically and understand our limitations once we're in office. They're not during campaigns talking about the limitations of running for office, of what they can do once elected.
Yeah, I mean, it's exhausting just to hear it, much less to experience it. Philip Klein, managing editor for the Washington Examiner. He's the author of the book. Maybe if we do get to 60, some of his ideas could be implemented. Overcoming Obamacare, 3 approaches to reversing the government takeover of healthcare. Philip, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what